In the 2 news hours, we'll cover significant news and events affecting our country, featuring Oleksa Kibkalo in the studio. Glory to Ukraine. The 95th Air Assault Brigade destroyed Russian war criminals who shot 9 Ukrainian soldiers who surrendered. A video has emerged of soldiers of the 95th Brigade tearing apart an assault group of Russians in one of the populated points in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. The Post says that these were soldiers from the 155th Marine Brigade, the Pacific Fleet of the Russian Federation, who especially like to boast about the abuse of prisoners, the shooting of Ukrainian soldiers who found themselves in a desperate situation and surrendered. The Communications Department of the 95th Separate Air Assault Brigade claims the fighters killed had captured 9 Ukrainian drone pilots during a breakthrough attempt the previous day, then shot them and posted the video on social media. The punishment came faster than the investigation. Prosecutor General Andrei Kostiano announced that his office had opened a criminal case over the shooting of Ukrainian prisoners. Violation of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The Ukrainian paratroopers killed the Russian Marines, but who is the customer? This is the state, the Russian Federation, in the person of the so-called President Vladimir Putin and his cohorts, with the active complicity of Russian citizens and international criminals. The response to this, along with the tens of thousands of crimes committed by Russia since the aggression began in 2014, will be inevitable, leading to severe consequences for what remains of the Russian Federation and for generations of its modern criminals. Tauride paratroopers repelled a massive Russian attack. The occupiers were assaulting with the support of 30 armored vehicles. 25 enemy armored vehicles with infantry moved in to storm the position of the 79th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade, holding the line in the Kurakhove sector with the support of 5 tanks. The occupiers failed to achieve surprise, as the columns were detected by Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance in time. The occupiers faced artillery fire and kamikaze drone strikes far from the outskirts. The tankers successfully joined the battle. Paratroopers of the 79th Brigade, repelling the attack, burned 7 armored vehicles with infantry and 1 tank. Another tank was hit. 33 occupants were killed and some burned out during this battle. The same number of Russians were wounded, the brigade's press service reports. Another escalation is taking place along the entire front line, with 80% of combat engagements. Ukrainian defenders are repelling the occupiers' attacks in the Kupyansk, Lyman, Kramatorsk, and other areas. The situation is most tense at Kurakhove. Poland is preparing a new air defense base capable of shooting down Russian ballistic missiles in the coming weeks. In the Polish village of Redzikowa, a missile defense base will be opened in this Pomeranian province, which has already been called a missile defense base. Shield. Radoslav Sikorsky announced the launch schedule and some details about the military facility, so that we can shoot down Russian missiles flying at Poland, not just Iranian missiles flying at the United States. Our opponents accused us of destroying the base project, but it already exists and will be officially opened soon. After the July NATO summit in Washington, Poland announced the operational readiness of its missile defense base. This base is the U.S. contribution to NATO's integrated air and missile defense system. Jens Stoltenberg in Washington then said that the base, which is part of NATO's missile shield, was ready to begin its mission. Polish Defense Minister Kosiniak-Kamysz said that the base would allow defense against mostly medium-range ballistic missiles that could be aimed at Europe or the United States. Previously, only Romania had such a system, and we are bringing our military expert to our conversation. The former head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Mykola Malamush. I'm glad you found time for our conversation. I know you don't have much time today, only 10 minutes, so I'd like to ask you a question without any extra bells and whistles. But first of all, glory to Ukraine.
Знаю, що часу на сьогодні у вас небагато, всього 10 хвилин, тому без зайвих еківоків хотів би вам поставити питання, але передусім слава Україні.
Glory to the heroes. I sincerely congratulate everyone. We have a difficult situation at the front. There is an escalation in the Kursk region, an escalation in Zaporizhzhia, and an escalation in Donbass. We have delays in the supply of weapons and the adoption of fundamental decisions by our Western partners to destroy targets in Russia. We often hear fears of a third world war, but it has already begun. A war of dictatorships against democracy, with Ukraine at the forefront. The militaries of at least Russia and North Korea are involved in this conflict, and we are currently confronting NATO's main adversaries. Some partners appear to be trying to extinguish the fire with water. Can we assume that the West, particularly the US, is morally preparing to relinquish its positions in Europe? First of all, we are talking about a strategic confrontation between the West and the totalitarian world. Russia, North Korea, and Iran, as you rightly said. To a certain extent, a number of countries play on the contradictions between Russia and the Western world. That's why the following positioning is happening now. The war is really going on in Ukraine, others are helping Ukraine, and totalitarian leaders are helping Russia. They are divided and starting a game of attrition. We anticipate that, given recent developments in the U.S. election campaign and changing governments in Europe, countries are increasingly aware of the high risk of war if issues in Ukraine persist. Poles, Germans, and others are already predicting a possible war in the near future if assistance to Ukraine is not provided. The only chance is to effectively help our country today and win on the front line, setting conditions for the Putin regime and its allies to withdraw from Ukraine and adopting a new model of world order and security guarantees for major global players. This model needs to be finalized. Concrete, active collaboration with Western leaders and representatives in security and defense is crucial today. In my experience, including while in the U.S., securing funding such as the proposed $51 billion was unlikely due to Republican and Trump opposition, which Putin was pleased about. To be blunt, direct contact with representatives of both Democrats and especially Republicans who disagreed with the Founding Fathers and influential groups like the military-industrial complex has yielded results. This included the passage of Package 61, leading even Trump to change his position 180 degrees. Today, a lot of work is being done to prepare a strategy for Ukraine's warfare, but with systemic forces and means. This is what Germany is doing, and one of the packages will be announced, I think, in the coming days. A huge package from the United States, up to $7.9 billion from the Pentagon stockpile, from the U.S. military-industrial complex. The package is being prepared by France, Britain, Scandinavian countries, a number of Central European countries, and Italy. In other words, we are focused on the fact that the West will not back down, but will specifically fill military supplies. In the coming days, I'll be honest, next week a decision will be made on large packages, especially on weapons and ammunition of the third, fourth, and fifth generation. This will ensure the replenishment of our armed forces, which is what Zelensky was talking about. There are brigades, but they need to be armed, and this will allow us to arm our military-industrial complex, which we have been talking about. These are our drones, which do not require any permits and are already hitting the territory of Russia at a distance of up to 300 kilometers. Our missiles have already appeared, the first hundreds that can strike in different waters at a distance of up to 200 kilometers. This is a permission to strike military targets. France has authorized it, Britain is still considering, and we may shift responsibility to the US. However, this is just a sectoral decision that complements our striking capabilities, with potential for hundreds of missiles and even millions of drones. Defense Minister Umerov announced that 200,000 have already been produced this year, and that 2.54 million are planned for next year. This will allow for powerful strikes against aircraft taking off from bases, strategic bombers, ballistic and tactical missile launchers, Shaheds, and other unmanned vehicles. Of course, this will also apply to combat positions and the destruction of enemy reserves, including Russia's human reserves in deep and near-front zones. Our time is coming. Having pulled up new reserves and capabilities provided by our Western partners, and what we are actively purchasing on foreign markets, the prospect of not only the Kursk strike, but 2 or 3 more such strategic strikes is becoming real. In 4 to 6 months, or 8 at most, we must change our warfare strategy, win at the front with our allies, and then enter the peace process. This requires a deep understanding from both political and military leadership and the development of a new strategy. It's essential to actively engage with allies through systematic work by high-level professionals in intelligence, defense, and cooperation. Simply calling on them is not enough. MFAs influence groups that have had personal and systematic contacts with many leaders and influential groups of these countries for decades. This symbiosis will give prospects for project implementation. Inviting and asking alone is ineffective. Yes, we will allow someone to give something, but it will take a long time. Logistics will be delayed, and time will be lost.
Це те, що потрібно зробити. Це зрозуміло. І, напевно, місцями це навіть очевидно, якщо брати...
Mr. Kovalchuk, this is what needs to be done. This is understandable and sometimes even obvious if we take the overall context. The behind-the-scenes work will never be revealed. It has its own subtleties. However, I would like to clarify your view on what we see in the Kurakhove direction.
Це прямий наслідок втрати вугледару. В такому випадку, який масштаб наслідків втрати вугледару ми можемо ще побачити?
The situation is critical following the loss of Vuhledar. We are currently discussing the enemy's tactical successes, but I believe mistakes were made in military planning. With intelligence on the enemy's attempt to flank a stronghold, we should have properly prepared our forces to counterattack from the rear and push the enemy back. This is a task for special operations forces. This symbiosis simultaneously demolishes all these ticks with fire. There was no need to complete any gift. I talked to the commanders of the 72nd Brigade and others who were in the area. It can be done, and it is almost impossible to take a city without encirclement. It would never have surrendered. It stood for 2 months, 2 years, and 8 months. 3 brigades, frankly, fighting Marines, the elite of Russia, as we call it, and many other special forces. It was a meat grinder to destroy the enemy's high-class reserves, but it failed. Now we are really talking about Kurakhove, Soledar, and other towns that are being used for tactical offensives. Next is the coverage of the Pokrovsk direction with the aim of encircling Pokrovsk itself. Putin has plans to enter Kramatorsk by the end of the year, but we will definitely not let him. We have already learned from these mistakes. For example, in the Narets and Kurakhove directions, the enemy is already approaching the cities, is in the suburbs, or even on individual streets. We are not only fighting defensive battles, we are also planning operations that will allow us to unblock these settlements. I foresee that our command, having gained experience, including negative lessons from Vuhledar and other cities, is now using non-standard solutions. The enemy tries to attack, then storms, flanks, and tries to surround the city, while simultaneously destroying it. This is where non-standard warfare strategies should be used. Kursk, Kupyansk, and then strike where the enemy does not expect it, on the occupied territories, destroying its forces. This should be systematically prepared and developed. Also at the tactical level, as Syrskyi said, who was near Vuhledar and Pokrovsk. Near Pokrovsk, they effectively employed unconventional tactics that caught the enemy off guard. This approach goes beyond mere defense and deterrence. By preparing additional forces, we can strike from flanks and rear, targeting reserves and disorienting the enemy. To achieve this, we must thoroughly study each operation, gather accurate intelligence, and secretly plan tactical operations, such as provocations in the Kursk region. That is why today we're talking about Kurakhove, Soledar, and Toretsk. These are the cities that require particularly effective non-standard actions by our troops. I think the command is working on this today. We are holding our positions, but the situation is, frankly, difficult. There is fighting, no change of positions, and in each city there are battles for streets, houses, even floors. This is the reality of today. But in this situation, we need to work not only on a single settlement, but also on a broader sector that would strike the enemy so that he could not hold his positions, let alone advance. Well, thank you, Mr. Kovalev, for your experience and for your cautious optimism. I hope that things will develop exactly as you described. I mean, in terms of the next few months, up to 6 or 8 months. Good evening to you, and I hope you have a good night. All the best, good luck, take care. Thank you in return.
Дякую, навзаєм. Я ж нагадаю, що на зв'язку зі студією був Микола Маломуш, генерал армії, екс-керівник служби зовнішньої розвідки України. Ну і продовжуємо нашу розмову.
I'd like to remind you that Mykola Malomush, general of the army and former head of Ukraine's foreign intelligence service, was on the phone with the studio. We're now bringing in Anatoly Krebchinsky, an aviation expert and deputy director of an electronic warfare company. I have specific technical questions for him. I apologize to our viewers, but given the current situation, it's important to understand these details to better grasp the unfolding agenda in Ukraine. Just to recap, you probably saw it, as did most journalists. I think that some of our viewers have definitely seen it as well. The analysis of the Institute for War Studies on the downing of the Su-34, which they believe was downed by a Ukrainian F-16. This Su-34 was a carrier aircraft, and it was destroyed during descent or on approach. We have discussed these points in our broadcasts, but I propose to add one more thing right now, and that is the aspect of the movement of the MiG-31, 2 planes to Belarus.
Це аспект пересування МіГ-31 двох бортів до Білорусі. Дивіться, у нас була розмова з Костянтином Криволапом.
We had a conversation with Konstantin Krivolap. He told us about the radars on these planes, which in active mode can illuminate targets deep in the rear. The enemy's ground-based radar station somewhere in passive mode receives the reflected signal and is already coordinating both the work of the planes dropping the bombs and the Russian air defense systems. So, can we assume that we are now seeing a kind of hunt for our F-16s, given that the Russian Federation is introducing an early warning system into our flank? Let's start with the fact that if we are talking about radar that Russia has, it is radar that was inherited from the Soviet Union. If we think that some high-tech solutions are coming from Russia, this is actually a misleading understanding, because most of the reconnaissance tools of the Russian Federation are used directly by unmanned systems, the same shakedowns or simulated targets that they launch together with shakedowns. They use a certain intelligence function. Who says that Russia is now partially blind? Why? We disrupted their capabilities by destroying the A-50 long-range radar detection aircraft and some radar equipment like the LET-T systems that operated in temporarily occupied territories in Russia, depriving their radar of the ability to see inside Ukraine. They discuss using certain radar equipment detected by ground systems, but the reality is they created the Okhotnik S-70 drone without a clear purpose, whether for reconnaissance or strikes. Initially, they planned to control it via Zortal and TK-157, but ultimately resorted to using ground-based systems, with the Su-57 serving as a repeater. We need to recognize that Ukraine can use ground-based radar systems like the Patriot to identify targets for F-16s, even with their radars turned off. While Russia's claims may be alarming, it still operates within the constraints of Soviet-era technology. Although it is attempting to progress and develop new programs, it is limited in its capabilities.
Наприклад, безпосередньо F-16 вимкнутими радарами, знаходячись близько до лінії бойового зіткнення, може знищити це Су-34.
Yes, it has the ability to obtain certain high-tech components because some countries help it circumvent sanctions. But we need to understand that most of the equipment used by the Russian Federation is all that they could copy either from Ukrainian or American equipment.
Так, у неї є можливість отримувати певні високотехнологічні комплектуючі за рахунок того, що певні країни допомагають їй обходити санкції. Але треба зрозуміти, що
Look, I understand that this is not a trivial task because the radar station
або з української техніки, зараз ми бачимо це активно, або з американської.
Must know exactly where the aircraft is located if we are talking about those MiG-31s. I would like to analyze whether such a scenario is practically possible or not. That is, we need to know where this aircraft is located in space. Can I show you the picture I'm talking about? Perhaps it will be easier. It's not quite clear, but it should show two MiG-31s radiating a signal to the target, or perhaps even one plane, and the reflected radar signal is sent to the radar station.
На МіГ-31, які випромінюють на ціль сигнал, а можливо навіть один літак. І відбитий сигнал радарний потрапляє на радарну станцію.
This allows you to calculate the aircraft's location, direction, and speed based on the reflection angle and Doppler effect, effectively gathering information about the target.
І врахування ефекту Доплера розрахувати місце, напрям руху і головне швидкість повітряної цілі. Ну, тобто зібрати про неї інформацію.
In general, the Russian Federation has the technical ability to implement such a scenario. Given what you said, we can say that in theory, this could be used in practice. The means used by the Russian Federation, it should be mentioned that the MiG-31 was developed in Soviet times and was designed as an aircraft to intercept possible missiles, that is, those launched from the United States or Europe.
То знов-таки, повертаючись до практичного використання, я впевнений, що так, за рахунок наявної російської техніки неможливо використати.
I have the following question. What capabilities does the Russian Federation have to counter our F-16 aircraft deep in our territory? Or is it impossible? I mean, during the operation. I'm not talking about strikes on ground targets in the places where the aircraft are deployed. I mean, our F-16s are acting as hunters and a kind of intimidation for Russian aircraft so that they cannot get within range of dropping guided bombs. Is there any way the Russian Federation can counteract the F-16s that are taking off in Ukraine right now? Is there a threat for our F-16s to engage Russian Su-34s? Returning to the capabilities of the Su-35, they have a radar system that allows them to see 300 kilometers. We need to realize that most Su-34 aircraft require constant repairs and replacement of certain components to keep them operating efficiently. Since 2008, Russia has been using Western components to make radar systems work. Returning to the airfield at the plant in Komsomolsk on the Amur, there are 35 Su-35s that are standing there without electronics because they can't finish them. Most of the airplanes that the corporation is currently producing are orders from 1918. What is the reason for this? After 14, until 18, and until 22, when certain sanctions restrictions came into effect, Russia was unable to receive a certain number of components. They began to actively look for the possibility of replacing some components. So in principle, they continue to write tactical specifications for the ability to see very far using radar. In reality, I believe they are limited to a range of no more than 180 kilometers. If we use F-16s equipped with AM-120 missiles, which can operate beyond 185 kilometers, and we've been promised such missiles, these aircraft can detect targets at 200 kilometers. This means we will be able to monitor all aircraft that Russia pushes. To our borders or the line of contact. I want to give a concrete understanding that we have the ability to defend ourselves against guided weapons, and it will now be expanded by receiving F-16 aircraft, which the Netherlands promises us.
Нідерланди, тому що вони, до речі, міністр оборони Нідерландів зазначив про передачу цих літаків безпосередньо в Харкові, в тому місті.
Therefore, I think that in the near future, we will see most of the downed Russian aircraft either due to the work of the F-16 itself or the work of the F-16 in combination with Patriot radar systems. And in the near future, we expect to receive long-range radar detection aircraft from Sweden, which will allow us to dominate the airspace by seeing 600 kilometers deep into Russia's territory. The transfer of Saabs was a real sensation, as we received one of the most advanced systems for detecting targets in the air. However, realizing that the Russian Federation can see the planes, but seeing an F-16 on its radar does not mean it can shoot them down. Does the Russian Federation have anything that it can launch far enough to reach our planes? Or will they still only see a picture and not, for example, the same missiles? It's clear that ground-launched anti-aircraft missiles have limited ranges, and while I doubt any can reach 300 kilometers, the Russian Federation has periodically claimed to possess long-range missiles. The reality is that we are limiting our combat operations to one F-16 against one Su-34.
Російська Федерація там періодично заявляла, що у них є далекобійні ракети. Так це чи ні?
Here we need to understand that the theater of operations is much more complicated, as there are planned operations and the process of turning on radar to capture targets. Again, it must be understood that such operations are carried out after receiving intelligence that, for example, Su-34s have taken off from a Russian airfield to strike Kharkiv or Sumy region. This is all happening in real time, when, for example, our radar equipment sees it and the same F-16s come out to meet them. And they are already working directly on these aircraft, understanding from which sector they are coming. After all, information is also obtained from certain ground sources, or, for example, intelligence. Therefore, it is wrong to limit ourselves to the question of how far the F-16 radar can see and how far the missiles fly, as a comprehensive approach is needed. American pilots spoke about this when they gave interviews to our journalists about the transfer of such F-16s. We need to understand that for the effective use of aircraft, a large number of weapons and reconnaissance or radar equipment must be used. Therefore, it is important to realize that the preparations by the Air Force have been enormous. And now I am more than sure that we will see most of the downed Russian aircraft. But I didn't hear your comment about the Russian Federation's capabilities. Do they understand what they are opposing, or do they have no countermeasures? The Russian Federation has started using Shahed drones. We started using 20 pieces on average per month. Later, after seeing some efficiency, they began to scale up production. In September, about 1,388 units were used, of which 88% were destroyed. So we need to understand that Russia will never fight with quality. It will fight with quantity. They have certain capacities in this direction. And we see dictator Putin's statements about the creation of, for example, technology parks, which, by the way, will be attended by young people who grew up on Russian propaganda, such as the Una army and others. Nevertheless, we need to understand that Russia is a legacy of the Soviet Union. Both in the Soviet Union and now in Russia, the main requirement is scale and a large number of weapons, but not quality. Even when tanks were being developed in the Soviet Union, it was assumed that out of 20 tanks, at least one would reach victory and survive. Unlike American or Western weapons, including unmanned systems, we prioritize high accuracy with our strikes. One flight, one hit. Our equipment remains in the rear, but we must recognize that Russia can still advance on the front line and in other areas with a large number of weapons and personnel. While their effectiveness is low individually, their sheer numbers, including in electronic warfare, can make them effective. It is constantly emphasized that Russia has high-quality electronic warfare capabilities that are highly effective due to their large numbers. This is a separate part of the armed forces, and they can create certain problems for our systems. But still, they are ineffective in countering unmanned systems because they are now using more Chinese components and means in electronic warfare. This is interesting. Based on the above, to close the gestalt on the MiG-31s transferred to Belarus, we can say that they have already left. It is also possible that this was an operation to cover and hide them. At least that was the theory. To understand the bigger picture, it is worth asking how many aircraft Russia has left that are capable of launching daggers. If we talk about MiG-31s, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia had about 130 of them, but this is not a modification that would allow them to carry daggers. Here we need to understand to what extent Russia is able to modernize its remaining fleet to re-equip.
Якщо ми кажемо про літаки МіГ-31, то на початок повномасштабного вторгнення Росія налічувала їх близько 130 штук. Але це не модифікація, яка дозволяла би нести кінжали. Тут треба зрозуміти, що наскільки Росія спроможна модернізувати той авіапарк, який залишиться в неї, для того, щоб
To the mode of carrying Dagger missiles.
режим несення ракет типу «Кинжал».
Let's recall the redeployment of MiG-31s to Belarus. Russia previously used these MiG-31s alongside long-range radar detection aircraft to scan Ukraine's surface and identify operating air defense systems. The signal signatures can indicate where systems like Patriot, Iris, or SAMP-T are active.
України, розуміючи, де які засоби протиповітряної оборони працюють. Тому що по сигнатурі сигналу насправді можна зрозуміти, по певним елементам можна зрозуміти, де працює Петру, де працює там Іріс або працює сам ті системи.
Now, Russia does not have this capability, so the relocation of the MiG-31 was simply an attempt by Russia to influence Europe. The planes actually stayed there for no more than 3 days, but the information field was very busy. And again, my comment was about this, that Russia is most likely just putting pressure on Europe because let's remember the strikes on the warehouses in Torka when Russia immediately came out with a statement about changing its nuclear doctrine. After recent strikes on Russia's strategic weapon stockpiles intended for use in Ukraine, we have deprived Russia of the ability to conduct active hostilities in Ukraine for at least the next quarter. They began to redeploy, for example, MiG-31 aircraft. So again, it is important to understand that what the Russian Federation has is a legacy of the Soviet Union. And the question is not whether it can use it, but how long it will be able to do so. Thank you, Mr. Anatoly, for such a detailed analysis and for a different view, certainly a new view, and it is absolutely logical. I hope that we will meet again on our programs and discuss purely Ukrainian issues. Having studied a lot of documents from open sources just a few days ago and today, I realized that Ukraine is capable of creating powerful means of production, electronic warfare, electronic stations, locators, and I hope that we will see their effective work in cooperation with partners.
І я сподіваюся, ми побачимо їх ефективну роботу і так само в співпраці із засобами ураження.
However, we need to talk less about this because the enemy is actively learning and looking for quick ways to counteract. When they started using drones for automated monitoring, it was predicted that these would be isolated cases, but now we see that the enemy is actively using them. There are solutions to counteract this, but we shouldn't talk about them so that the enemy doesn't prepare to use means that would be ready to counteract us. Roger that. So let our silence explode powerfully on the enemy's territory. Let's end the conversation like this. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for taking the time to talk. Let me remind you that Anatoly Krebchinsky was on the line with the studio, an aviation expert and deputy director of an electronic warfare company.
Є рішення протидії, але про них не треба казати, щоб ворог вже не готувався теж застосовувати засоби, які були би готові до нашої протидії.
We literally have a little time left, and I want to say that, in addition to strong production, we are developing our scientific potential. We have people who are currently at war, including our special forces, and they need help. Right now, Channel 24 is holding a fundraiser for a mini excavator for the Kraken unit, which performs special operations. From the videos we see, we realize how difficult these tasks are. So for their safety and to fulfill their tasks, they need to construct engineering structures, build caponiers, shelters, and various defenses as quickly as possible at the place where they arrived. This is what the mini excavator we found and will be able to deliver should help them do.
Кракен, який виконує спеціальні операції, який виконує ті операції,
I hope we can do it very quickly. The cost of this excavator is $870,000, and we have already managed to raise 36% of the amount. But we need to do it as quickly as possible, as the enemy is advancing, and our fighters need to respond just as quickly.
Капоніри, робити захисти, заробити різні укриття. І ось в цьому їм має допомогти оцей міні-екскаватор, який ми знайшли і який ми зможемо...
So you see the QR code, and whoever can, please join in. 10 UH, 30 UH, 50 UH. Any small contribution is a small drop in our great sea.
Ми вже встигли зібрати за цей час 36% від суми. Але нам потрібно це зробити максимально швидко, оскільки бачимо, що ворог наступає, і з іншого боку наші бійці мають також швидко реагувати на це. Тому бачите, QR-код, буквально хто скільки може, 10 гривень, 30 гривень, 50 гривень, будь-який маленький внесок – це маленька крапля в нашому великому морі перемоги.
Don't forget to help our military.
Давайте зробимо це разом.